every year, I think we've woken up for the last 6 years and gone, it's New Year's Day. This year's going to be so much better. And I think we are really owed a cracker of a year in 2026. I think a lot of people have had an incredibly tough 12 months for all sorts of reasons. I'm hoping that we all have an opportunity to breathe out and to discover the things that we have in common, and that we have space to honour that in the ways that bring us closer together.
The presenting sponsor for Socially Democratic is Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people and organisations who want to build power to make the world a better place. And if you want to create change in your world in 2026, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. A special shout out to all of our Patreon members. If you want to join those wonderful supporters of our podcast and financially support our show so we can continue to produce great episodes each week, then we encourage you to click on the link in the show notes and subscribe to the Patreon of Socially Democratic. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. For over a century, Maurice Blackburn has stood up for fairness, championing the rights of everyday Australians and shaping landmark legal reforms. Today, they're harnessing new technologies to make justice more accessible, more efficient, and more responsive to the needs of modern Australia. All right, let's get on with today's episode. We are taping this one on a Friday afternoon on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And for those who have only found this podcast in the last 12 months, you are discovering that we do in December a series of episodes that are our wrap of the year. And each year we have done a wrap of Victorian State politics with our guest that I'm about to introduce. And it's normally our last episode before the end of the new year, and I'm pleased to welcome her back on the show. She's the Minister for the Suburban Rail Loop, the Minister for Housing and Development, Victoria and Precincts. I think I've just blended a couple of portfolios there, but she can explain to me what I've just made a mistake on with. But anyway, welcome back, Harriet Shing, to the pod. That was a terrible introduction, but I don't care. Let's just do this.
Yeah, it was a terrible introduction, but thank you for your candour. So I've got Suburban Rail Loop, Housing and Building Development Victoria and Precincts, and thanks for having me back again. It's really good to join you. Annual wrap-ups are a good thing indeed when there's a lot to talk about, and there's certainly a lot to talk about. So can't think of anything I'd rather be doing more than having this chat with you.
Well, Christmas is next week, and as I said, we're taping this one on a Friday. But as we start to turn our attention to Christmas, we also have to reflect on what happened last weekend, which was the horrific terrorist attack in Bondi at the Hanukkah by the Sea event. And we'll talk a bit more about sort of community safety and protest laws in a moment. But I just kind of want to get your reflections on the tragic event that happened, even from a personal standpoint, like, when did you first hear about it? What was your initial reaction? That kind of stuff. Yeah,
it was utterly devastating. And I don't think that that's an experience at all unique to me. The news of what had happened was nightmarishly awful. This atrocity that was unfolding in real time was the reflection of the worst of humanity, with the actions of the two assailants. And then alongside that, the most extraordinary acts that have since come to light of sacrifice and heroism and humanity and people guiding strangers to safety. And then against the backdrop of all of that, so much loss and injury and the grief and the raw hurt and anger and despair that has rippled around Australia and around the world is really something that I think is so worth holding on to as much as anything, because it has to be put to use in making sure that we hold those responsible accountable, that we call this for what it is, which is a terrorist act of anti-Semitic hatred that has forever changed the lives not just of those people who were at Hanukkah by the Sea celebrating a festival of light, and an occasion of joy and resilience and determination and the exceptional and exceptionally important history of Jewish community around the world. But the communities around the people who were celebrating, who were galvanised into action in the most horrific of circumstances. I think it's going to take a long time for people to heal, but I think in doing that, we also need to be putting all of these feelings and all of these responses and reactions into action. I think it's been really clear that we need to do more, not just as governments, but as communities, as individuals, to make sure that people are able to be visible. And in order to be visible, you need to be safe. And we've seen an increase in anti-Semitism over the last couple of years. And we've seen that our Jewish communities have felt ever less safe. And that culminated in the most tragic of circumstances last weekend. And I think for a long time, people are going to be reeling as they should, as we should, from what's occurred.
I'm pleased that you said we need to do more. I felt we recorded a podcast on Wednesday, which is dropping today, as you and I are recording this one for next week. That was with it was the Feeney Files with Jesse McCrone. So David Feeney, Jesse McCrone, and myself dedicated the entire episode to talking about what happened on Sunday and the response from various authorities, and then had a deeper conversation about anti-Semitism in this country. So I don't sort of want to relitigate any of that stuff, but I'm pleased to hear you say that we need to do more. I'm just noticing, and like you said, it's early days. You know, the first funeral is only happening today. There's a lot of grieving that will need to take place in the Jewish community, and obviously various forms of government are going to have to take the time to examine what has happened. But I just noticed that from the federal government standpoint, there was not a reluctance, but I'm just not getting a sense that they're saying that we need to do more, that they're trying to spend time saying, well, we've done this and we've done that and we've done, X since the Siegel report was first handed down, but not saying, well, actually, I think it's okay to actually acknowledge as governments that we didn't do enough. Clearly we didn't do enough because there are 15 people that are now dead. But I'm pleased to hear you say that we need to do more. And I'm just wondering what that looks like, though. Maybe you don't know the answer to that just yet, but as governments, what can we do to reassure our communities that we are here to protect you and ensure that you're safe and you can practice your faith or practice your own freedom of expression or community or culture in a safe space and not worry about the circumstances that unfolded in Sydney last week?
Well, I think for many Jewish Australians, and I'm not Jewish, so I'm speaking about this from a bystander perspective, but I think that what has happened has really deepened or intensified fear that was already there. I think that what has happened is something that, again, has had its seeds sown in the past couple of years, but also that anti-Semitism is a constant fear, and it is constantly something in the minds of Jewish Australians and Jewish communities all over the world. And it should never be for anyone, and in this instance for our Jewish community, a question of choosing between being visibly of the Jewish faith, visibly of Jewish culture, or being safe. And in order to be visible, you have to be safe. And we then, as as allies, non-Jewish Australians need to be safe for Jewish Australians. And in creating that safety, we're then creating an opportunity for people to visibly practice their faith and to visibly practice, all of the culture of Judaism. And I know this. I've been as a member of the queer community in a situation where I, often haven't felt safe. And to see symbols of safety, to see behaviour from others that models and demonstrates safety it's like an opportunity to breathe out. There are lots of places where I go where I wouldn't advertise that that I'm in a relationship with a woman. There are lots of places where my family with Chinese heritage wouldn't demonstrate Chinese cultural practice or tradition because of these nasty undercurrents of racism. And there are lots of places where Jewish Australians and Jewish families have not been safe and have backup plans about what they do and where they go and how they express their faith or their cultural identity. And so I don't think that this is a new thing, but I think that what is really, really clear that this increase in anti-Semitism over the last couple of years shows really clearly that as individuals, as people like me, as a human being, I need to do more, that we as communities need to do more. It might be that in the aftermath of what's occurred, we give blood or we provide support, we demonstrate that really important solidarity. But in the longer term, it's also about saying, how do we stand up against the temptation to acceptance or to a blind eye? How do we make sure that we're not accepting that? And this is the work that governments also need to be doing. There's been funding that's been committed to provide support to Jewish communities. There's been increased security. But again, in the long term, what are we doing to make sure that we are recognising this increase in anti-Semitism and that we're not only recognising it and not only describing the problem, these deep-seated issues of division, the impact of words that is then translated into actions of the worst, most unimaginably awful of tragedies, but that we're then staying the course on that.
We had the Premier on the pod earlier in the year and we talked about this topic, and I sort of ran through, and you mentioned before about how we've seen an increase in forms of anti-Semitism, not just in Victoria but across the country, and I sort of went through a number of them with her, and she actually said on the show, like she said, that when the Free Palestine March went down to the National Gallery of Victoria, because one of their biggest donors happens to be Jewish, she called it out. She said that's anti-Semitic, and I thought she was really, really strong on that, and I think she's been very strong on it in the days following Sunday. I'm wondering about how do you balance the right for people to protest at the same time as ensuring the various communities' safety and pushing back against when protest tips into sort of racial hatred or extremism. I mean, how do we strike that balance as from a government standpoint?
I think that there is a role for protest, but not where it is an excuse or where it creates a cover for actions that incite hatred, actions that incite violence. I think that we need to be able to be clear with the community about actually standing firm that there is zero tolerance for conditions that create or that nurture or that turn a blind eye to anti-Semitism. And I think that we need to be unambiguous in condemning hate speech. And we've passed anti-vilification laws here in Victoria. We've recently passed changes to the laws that mean that protesters can be required to unmask, that mean that protesters can't affix themselves to structures, that create opportunities for designated areas that give police more powers. But we also we need to be able to ensure that these new criminal offences for incitement are able to do their work around cracking down on violence or serious vilification at public assembly. We cannot create or foster circumstances that enable hate speech to occur, because it's words that then translate into actions, and it's that division that then creates a circumstance of, it's almost permission in the minds of some people to be able to turn that into action and violence and the sort of senseless tragedy that we are still grappling with, not just here in Australia but all around the world.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, I've tried to stay off Twitter in the last couple of days because it's just an absolute cesspool right now. But there's this big argument that's happening about, and Chris Minns, the Premier in New South Wales, is talking about like large protests, and there's been a pushback certainly from, I guess, what you'd call the left on social media about you can't ban a protest of 30,000 people or 300,000 people going across the bridge in Sydney because they were protesting against a war in another part of the world, and that they're making the argument that protest did not lead to these two people going into a park and shooting a bunch of Jewish people having a Hanukkah celebration. And there's truth in that, but at the same time, there were at all of those Free Palestine rallies, there were chants that were anti-Semitic, and at the same time, we've had ultra right wing protests happen in our very city. That if something was to happen in the future where people's lives were taken by radical right wing nut jobs, the same argument could be made that those protests may have led to these incidents. And I just think what I worry about is that we're being hypocritical in one instance, saying, oh, well, that protest was fine and that didn't lead to what happened in Sydney. But if we see some right-wing nut jobs go out there and do some protests and that leads to violence, that is the reason for it. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm worried that we're just picking and choosing our arguments based on what side we're on, whereas we should be looking at it in a more holistic way of saying any form of extremism, whether it be hate speech, to your point, or what leads to then violence, needs to be stamped out. And I think, I don't want to use the term zero tolerance because it's such a cliche, term, but I just wonder about governments need to really put the foot down and say any form of hate or any form of extremism, like during COVID, like some of the crazy stuff that was going on. I remember that day when the police were getting attacked by all of the anti-vaxxer, protesters.
Effigies of politicians.
Yeah.
Gallows, that was what we saw out the front of Parliament. But this is the work that the law has to do is to make it clear and beyond doubt that you can protest, but you can't preach hate, and you can't create the circumstances that give permission for people to incite violence or commit hate-based crime. And we've had Nazis protesting out the front of Parliament. We've banned the Nazi salute, but we've also seen that there's a need to do that. That, again, your point about X and the Twitter sphere, the social media space, I think is a really important one. Social media is an unregulated space, putting to one side things like the ban for kids under the age of 16. This is a space where, again, I think there's been a sense of entitlement that you can say whatever you want without consequence.
Yeah.
And I think that has spread into our everyday lives. I think that is a very dangerous space for us to be in, because it creates, without boundaries around it, about impact, it creates circumstances that lead to this huge sense of almost permission or entitlement to say whatever you want without any sense of responsibility for what might happen as a result. And words really, really, really matter. And words are the start of what all too easily turns into violence and tragedy. And this is, again, why we need to make sure that we're doing more. These declared assembly zones are really important. We also need to make sure that police are resourced to be able to respond, and that they can do their job to make and to keep people safe. And the police are doing a remarkable job. They are out around the state. Too many of their resources have been condensed and centralised into the CBD because there have been, again, a small number of people who have preached hate at a range of demonstrations where the vast majority of people who are gathering don't use that language. But we are seeing that the circumstances and the conditions have been created for that language to be used.
Yeah. Yeah, it's surreal isn't the word, but this has been a shocking year, really, in terms of the way that we as a community have not been able to be cohesive with one another and have in the public discourse, agree to disagree, but sort of move on. It's just been and living in the city, in the CBD, just seeing it play out every weekend. It's just been nuts. But anyway, hopefully when the clock strikes 12 on New Year's Eve, we draw a line in the sand and we all look at each other and go, we need to kind of get on with each other a bit more, I think, just to have a...
Well, there is a space. I think there's a space in all of this to come back to the things that we have in common. And here in Victoria, the things that we have in common that I think we should be rightly proud of are the value that we place on multiculturalism. That, I think, has taken a blow. My dad was, he was routinely singled out for racist abuse. He was the son of a fruiter at the Vic market, and all the Chinese fruit and veg stall holders would band together and routinely just cop it from people. And that happened to him, growing up, and to his dad and to the family, for as long as he could remember. This is not a new thing, but the circumstances and the viciousness of how that is being given flight, has been given permission to flourish, is something that is, I think, unique, except that we've seen it before in history. But every year, I think we've woken up for the last 6 years and gone, it's New Year's Day, this year's going to be so much better. And I think we are really owed a cracker of a year in 2026. I think a lot of people have had an incredibly tough 12 months for all sorts of reasons. I'm hoping that we all have an opportunity to breathe out and to discover the things that we have in common, and that we have space to honour that in the ways that bring us closer together.
Indeed. You're leaving the Christmas message. You should be dropping that towards the end there, but yeah.
I think as many opportunities as I have to drop it,
We'll take it.
Will not be enough. Yeah, exactly.
It has been just changing topics now. I want to move on to an area that's actually literally in your portfolio, which is both infrastructure and housing. And I want to start with infrastructure. It's been a huge year for the Victorian State government in terms of infrastructure. A whole bunch of projects have come to fruition or have been finalised, and like infrastructure, it feels like it is Labor's trump card. Like it's sort of the thing that everyone knows this current iteration of a Labor government as being something that they've done a lot on. Like if politics was a film, the film Karate Kid, I feel like Labor was Daniel LaRusso and then the infrastructure projects are the crane kick at the end of the film. Like, it's like, this is the one that, you know, everyone's waiting for. Metro Tunnel, Westgate Tunnel, obviously you've begun the suburban rail loop starting to take shape. I was overseas when the Metro Tunnel opened earlier this month, late last month. What's been the response from the general public since the Metro Tunnel opened? I haven't even been on it yet. I've just seen photos of people going on it, and it looks amazing.
It is just extraordinary. It is the most unbelievable feat of engineering expertise. And I can imagine that a fair few people who listen to Socially Democratic have already seen the stations and travelled on the trains. It is something which builds on the work of the City Loop. And when the City Loop was built, just for a bit of context, the De Grave Street underpass was the only subterranean work that had been done in the city, apart from sewage and essential works. And the blokes who did the City Loop used hand-operated machinery to do it. And it took decades and decades to complete. And I was, it was a privilege. It was an honour. I was privileged to go down to the State Library station and to Parkville and to tour those stations with the guys who had built City Loop. And
that's pretty cool.
A couple of them are in their 90s, and it was like Ocean's 11. When at the end of the film, there's this row of guys standing at the Bellagio fountain in Las Vegas, just looking out at everything before they sort of disperse. To see these guys who had been at the start of Melbourne's growth and expansion with heavy rail infrastructure, looking at what they had catalysed and what has now been built, was just the most extraordinary thing. And they came on board as engineers and as construction experts, and to see these huge underground spaces for turn up and go services, and the art and the design and the sense of space and the accessibility, the way that people can get around has never been more important now to take account of wheelchairs and frames and strollers and people who need extra time and space. And everything from the way that noise is tempered to the way that steps are designed to lines of sight, the colours of the markings on the ceiling, so you know if you're coming in or going out. It's just amazing, and I would encourage people to get into the system and to explore it. We've got free public transport on weekends to say thank you to people for all the disruptions. So that happens between now and February, when we add, I think it's an extra 1,000 services as the scale up happens for those extra services across Metro. But this then means you can go from Sunbury out to Pakenham, and it takes all this pressure off the City Loop. It means the Frankston line is coming back into the City Loop, and it sits alongside the Westgate Tunnel, which has just opened as well. And this is work which, again, takes years and years to deliver, but it also helps the city to grow well. And we have to think about this in terms of future generations. When we first... I say it like I was there. I wasn't there. I may look old and tired, but when we first developed and delivered 500,000 sewage connections to Melbourne, it wasn't because the need was immediately there. It was about saying, how are we growing, and what do we make sure that, what do we do that we make sure that we're investing now in infrastructure that will stand the test of time. And that's also where Melbourne Airport Rail comes in, and the Sunshine Super Hub, and being able to run 70 services an hour through Sunshine untangles all of that bit of the network. And that's, again, where Suburban Rail Loop comes in as well, and work is full steam ahead across those sites.
Harriet, you sound like a bit of a gunzel. I don't know if you were before you did this job, but
I'm mad for a bit of a train. It's just to see the shape of what rail investment does and how it transforms cities is something that's it's not unique to any one city, but the major cities around the world that have orbital rail can then deliver so much more around the delivery of housing and the connection of people to what a polycentric city looks like. And back in 2019, we had Plan for Melbourne. And Plan Melbourne actually set out the need for this polycentric city model, that we needed to actually pull the growth out of Melbourne's CBD. And the answer that the Liberals came up with was radial bus services. And anyone who's spent time on our roads in peak hour would probably agree that that's not really a workable idea as far as alleviating congestion. And this is where rail is incredibly important. And we've been on the sites for the suburban rail loop from Cheltenham to Box Hill since 2022. We've got the tunnel boring machine cutter heads are here and are arriving. We've got the most amazing work happening in engineering expertise and the award of the line-wide contract, and work with the Commonwealth, where the Prime Minister has been really clear about the importance of this project. There is funding coming in the Commonwealth budget next year. The Treasurer, the Transport Infrastructure Minister, multiple voters at multiple elections have backed this project in, and it's a long-term project. It's a big project, and it's a necessary one, and it's already transforming the city. Thousands of workers. We're talking about 4,000 workers at the moment, up to 8,000 workers across the job overall. That's not just about jobs. It's about apprentices and trainees, and it's about local content and trains that will be developed and fitted out, fully automated trains right here in Victoria. So the Libs are saying they're going to scrap it. When they say pause and review, that actually means let's let the tunnel boring machine sink into the ground and let's sack thousands of workers, just to be really, really clear. And we're building it. Every day it's happening.
It feels like, certainly this year with the federal election, the election here in Victoria was almost become the sort of a subtext of the debate in Victoria was around the suburban rail loop. And more so within like the Labor Party ranks, I kind of got a sense that there was all these Western MPs, and we've talked about it on the show ad nauseum about, there was chatter coming out of the federal caucus about whether or not they should fund it, whereas the Victorian State government was like, no, we're doing this. This is a thing that's happening. And in my mind, I was starting to doubt, going, is this project actually going to, what is the future of this project? But the announcement by the Albanese government for funding in the next Commonwealth budget is that I don't want to say is that a nail in the coffin to the doubt, as obviously you've still got the Tories here in Victoria saying that they're going to pull up stumps on it. But I feel like that it's kind of, we're at a stage now where you can't turn back, right? Like you said, the boring machines are about to go into the ground and start digging a big tunnel underneath the burgers of Cheltenham to Box Hill. It'd be a bit silly to then not continue this journey all the way around orbital Melbourne, right?
Yeah, so the suburban rail loop, and it's a loop, it's not a segment, kicks off in Cheltenham, and the first stage takes it around to Box Hill. From there, it kicks on to Doncaster, which is, again, Doncaster Rail. People might remember that as a previous Liberal promise that never got anywhere. Round to Fawkner and Reservoir and right up around to Broadmeadows. And then that goes up to and links around to the airport and to Melbourne Airport Rail, and then back to Sunshine and then out to Werribee. But as I said, it's a huge project. It's a project that's been backed in, but it's a project that's also going to take decades. And so we've got a business and investment case. Just for anyone out there who thinks that it doesn't exist, I can assure you it's 1,000 pages well worth reading. And I've indeed been through it multiple times myself, and I keep inviting the opposition to do the same, and I keep tabling it in Parliament, and people keep denying it exists. But I will continue my evangelical efforts in that regard. But it's also then about saying we can't just do one thing at once. Governments need to be able to be managing the pipeline of investment right across the whole state, and that's where you need to be able to develop and deliver Melbourne Airport Rail. And we've got a partner in Canberra that is helping us to do that. And we've got the work happening to make sure that we get that rail network up and running as part of broader transport network investment. And we've got North East Link happening. And the work on the Westgate Tunnel has meant that we're cutting dramatically the travel times and giving a second option for river crossing for people who are travelling in cars. We're taking all those trucks off the roads in the west. Melbourne Metro and the Metro tunnel work and additional services, and 87 level crossings have been removed. In the west, there's 500,000 trees being planted. There's work to make sure that we're delivering infill, where we're building into existing suburbs as part of the housing statement work to take pressure off the outer west and the outer north that have borne the brunt of growth. And we just need to make sure we continue with that work. We also need to make sure that we're delivering on livability. Right? It has to be about opportunity for people to buy a home or to be within walking distance of their job or a university or their school or their healthcare.
Well, it's a good segue to talk about housing because I feel like next year we're going to be campaigning on housing. I think that, the Liberal opposition, the new leader, said in her opening statements that housing was one of the things that she was going to focus on. And this is your portfolio. Do you relish the opportunity to go and have a debate with the Tories about housing? Because I'm wondering about what is Labor's message going to be to the electorate in terms of housing versus what the Tories' message is going to be to the electorate about housing, particularly when you're talking about trying to infill. People want to live closer to the city. But there are a lot of suburbs that don't want medium density housing built or high density housing. How are we going to change the makeup of our city so people can live closer into the city and not continue to grow our sort of urban boundary further and further away so we end up like LA?
Well, I don't think the Liberals or the Greens, for that matter, are interested in having a debate. They're interested in describing the problem. And describing the problem never actually put a roof over anyone's heads.
And I think we're pretty aware of the problem too, aren't we? Like we've talked about that ad nauseum.
Everybody knows what the issues are. The challenges are of affordability and availability. And we have all of this unmet demand across the state. And that's pushed prices up. It's made it harder to find a rental property. It's created all sorts of inequity that means that people have had to live on the very outskirts of Melbourne and commute for hours. And that's not just something that reduces your quality of life. It's something that costs a lot of money. It's something that takes up a lot of time. And we need to address that. Back in 2022, we released a housing statement. And that housing statement has set out the target of 800,000 homes over a decade. Now, that is a big number, and it's a number that is necessarily ambitious. It's a necessarily high bar. And in order to deliver on as much housing as possible, we had a range of initiatives that have been intended not only to get homes built faster, but also to make sure that we're not requiring still the outer suburbs to carry the burden of that growth. Because, and anyone of your listeners who sits in traffic for hours at a time coming in from the north or from the west to get into the city will know this. We've seen huge growth across Hume, Melton, Wyndham, and that's been in around 400% growth in the same period that suburbs in the inner south of Melbourne have seen at the same time as about 24% to 30% growth.
When you say that, do you mean by dwellings?
Yeah, in terms of the number of dwellings that have been constructed, approved or completed. And this is where, again, we've seen this unchecked growth. And part of that's geographic because the spread has simply been allowed to continue in an unregulated fashion. That goes right back to the post-war period where, again, these vast tracts of land were opened up in the north and in the west. And what's happened since then is that we have these enormous, as far as the eye can see, these landscapes of housing, and there's a need to retrofit infrastructure into those communities because it just hasn't been put there in the first instance. So things like planting 500,000 trees in Melbourne's west, the joining up of infrastructure, so the Westgate Tunnel, which is open now, the Sunbury line is now level crossing free. That's, is part of the 87, I think, level crossings we've removed. The work on the Sunshine Super Hub, so that's about untangling a really knotted up rail system that can then mean that we can get 70 trains through there every hour. These are the sorts of things that we're having to do after the fact to make it less challenging for people who call that part of the city home to get around. But we also know that it's a question of equity and fairness. If people are spending hours in traffic, then they're losing hours of time spent with their family or spent at work earning an income or, saving money, because it costs money to sit in traffic. It costs money to drive to and from work if you don't have access to public transport. And you factor in work like the Melton electrification and Melbourne Airport Rail work that we've announced and that infrastructure, and you can start to see where we are taking that discussion around what livability looks like. And within the housing space, we're also delivering a lot of work to make sure that when we build into those inner suburbs, we are sharing the burden, but that we're also looking at livability at the same time. And this, back in 2019, Plan Melbourne, which was a Liberal initiative, Matthew Guy was the architect of Plan Melbourne, identified that we needed to actually deliver on a polycentric city model. So drawing people out of Melbourne to live and to work was a really big part of understanding how we manage population growth and how we address the challenges of a lack of livability in parts of the city. So Plan for Melbourne identified the problem, but the solution that it proposed was a radial bus network, in essence. Now, anyone who sat in traffic going in and around the orbital parts of Melbourne will know that that doesn't solve any problems whatsoever, apart from perhaps an opportunity for more fine bus drivers to be on our network. However, we need to do something about the issue, and this is where, again, the suburban rail loop comes in. It is all about housing. It's about making sure, again, we're not only providing additional housing, but we're also doing that alongside a range of the transport and activity centres. So it is hundreds of thousands of houses across transport and activity centres, precincts, the suburban rail loop precincts, and we want to make sure that as we do that, we're doing it in a way that connects people within walking distance of their universities or their jobs or childcare or schools, healthcare. So this is how we make sure that as we grow, we're growing well. In contradistinction, the Libs are very, very happy to talk about the problem, but they don't actually have any solution that is deliverable in a way that doesn't then encroach upon the leafy suburbs that they claim as their heartland. So we've got the latest leader of the opposition, Jess Walsh, talking a big game around housing availability, but she's also got the challenge within her own shadow cabinet of three of her most senior shadow ministers coordinating a rally, a protest in the streets of Brighton to seek to block more housing being delivered in that part of the world that incidentally has delivered between 20 and 30% of the housing as compared to the outer suburbs, again, that 400%. So the Liberals have got a really big challenge because there isn't actually any way through the tension that they have within their own party, that on the one hand says we recognise that there's a shortage of housing, but on the other hand says we just need to make sure that we're taking care of the status quo in those wealthier suburbs that are more proximate to services, where, again, we need to make sure that we do have that infill opportunity. And this is where the planning work that we're doing is so important. It's also work that is actually shifting the dial. We are building and approving more homes than other major cities. We do have less of an affordability challenge than other major cities. And that's not happening by accident. It's happening because we're doing the work to make sure that it's easier to build, that there are initiatives and incentives that exempt people from stamp duty or provide concessions. And the Albanese government has picked up a number of the initiatives that we had. So the Home Buyers Equity Scheme, that was a Victorian initiative that got more than 11,000 people into homes because you save a 5% deposit we would then pick up the balance, which then means that you don't need mortgage lenders insurance and you can actually get into the home market rather than seeing that, perpetually your deposit on your savings don't enable you to buy a house. That's now gone federal with Help to Buy scheme, incidentally held up by the Liberals and the Greens. So there's a lot of work that we are doing that is working, but we have to stick at it and have to make sure that whether it's a townhouse, whether it's apartment buildings, whether it's the precincts in and around our rail network and our future, network like the suburban rail loop, that we're actually doing that work hand in glove with councils and with developers and with communities.
I mean, that's the question I was going to ask. So when you talk about backfill, you're talking about areas where there is currently just low density housing, but there is space or the opportunity to build some medium density housing. How does a state government encourage that to happen? Like, is there a regulatory things that has to happen first of all to ensure that you can rezone or start to build medium density housing, and how do you encourage developers to go in there? I'm just curious as to how we're going to make this happen, because I'm worried about we're going to have the Kiwi build situation with the campaign that the Labor Party ran over in New Zealand about the Kiwi dream or whatever it was. They're going to build, however many homes and they end up building 6. Like, we want to avoid that, obviously. Yeah,
I mean, we've built more than 6. So I think we're probably outpacing our Kiwi friends to a significant order of magnitude. We need to tackle this from a range of different perspectives. So there's the planning system, and this is where the plan for Victoria and the planning reforms that the planning minister's been rolling out have been really important. That's about fast-tracking planning approvals. It's also about making subdivisions easier, about being able to have a small second dwelling, so a granny flat, essentially, that you can build on your property. If you've got a block of at least 300 square metres, you can put up a small second dwelling of up to 60 square metres without needing a planning permit. We've also modernised the planning system that hasn't been fit for purpose for a really long time. We're in the process of a lot of reforms to the Planning and Environment Act, which is it's more than 30 years old. So the city was very different, and the way that we build and make decisions has changed dramatically since then. We've also got modern methods of construction. So what most people think of when we talk about that is the old shipping container with a door out the back of your portable at school, and things are so different now. The way in which we build prefabricated or off-site or modular methods of construction can be anything from a partial build, so a pod, for example, a bathroom unit that you might put into a house, right through to an entire house, so that it's no longer stick build in terms of from the ground up. It's basically an entire house constructed off-site that you can then truck in. And particularly for regional and rural areas, it means that in a workforce shortage, you can get a home onto a site and you can get it completely done and set up and ready to go, turnkey ready in a matter of days rather than months. So there's a whole lot of work happening in that space. We also need to make sure that we're providing the right incentives and the right market conditions for developers and for industry to make these developments viable. And this is where the work around the transport and activity centres has been important. The developer facilitation program, that's a fast tracking program, which means that if you have a development of a certain value, that you can then get a faster turnaround process. It's also about how we develop buildings and built environments, so that we are not seeing time after time objections from people who don't even live near the area, and that is then often used to stymie that growth. So there's a whole range of different initiatives that are working, and it is becoming less unaffordable. We've got a heap of work to do in the space of wages not keeping pace with home values. We've got a heap of work to do to make sure that we are supporting workers to get into key worker accommodation, affordable housing, and social housing is a big part of that work as well. We've got 91,000 social housing homes around the state, and we're building a lot of new ones, but a lot of them are also old, and that's where the high-rise tower redevelopment program comes in as well. That's about 39 hectares of land in inner urban areas, and we are going to be not only demolishing those towers that everyone knows it's a hallmark of the horizon in Melbourne. These are homes that they're really old. They were built between the 1950s and the 70s. They're no longer fit for purpose. They are far inferior to the homes that we're building today, and we're demolishing them over decades, so between now and the 2050s, and we will treble the density across those sites. Across those 39 hectares, we'll be able to house around 30,000 people, which is 3 times as many as there are now. That has to be part of an overall jigsaw of what we do to make housing more available. And we also need to make sure that there's a mix of housing for people as well.
2 things. One, and this is a terrible segue, and Grace, our producer, is going to be very annoyed at me doing this because it's now going to turn this podcast into a longer episode. But I was recently in Palm Springs, celebrating my 50th birthday with some friends, and we did a tour of the mid-century modern homes. Obviously, Palm Springs is very famous for this.
Pastels. Very famous for pastels.
Yeah, absolutely. And this explosion in the 1940s and 50s and 60s of mid-century, post-war mid-century style architecture. And we did a bike tour, and they were sort of explaining to us how this all sort of came about and the history of it, which is actually quite fascinating. And I'm not going to go into it, but it's got a lot to do with a historic native title case that was taken to Congress for the local Native American tribe that owned the land and leased it back. But they could only do short-term leases and weren't able to make enough money from it. They were the most poorest tribe in North America. And then they changed the laws to make them 99-year leases in which they could then make more money and more return for the leases. Anyway, when that happened, these developers saw an opportunity and came in and said, oh, well, we'll build all these homes on all of this leased land and basically just, build Palm Springs. And so they approached a couple of architects who designed these sort of West Coast mid-century homes that were in this particular style that was garage or carport, breeze door, window, wall framework, and the insides of them were all basically the same, but they could just rotate what the front looked like depending. So each house didn't look the same, basically. And they were all prefabbed. And so you could go to the architect and say, I want that style, and they would have it built within 3 weeks.
Like a kit home, like A.V. Jennings in the 80s.
Yeah, basically, yeah. But these homes are now worth millions of dollars. But in those days, they were middle class. It was middle class housing development in this expansion program in this particular town, because after the war and the rationing and that a lot of materials were no longer available, and so they were sort of focusing more on function over form. But so your home could get built in three weeks. Like you literally sign the papers and the documents, hand over your deposit, and in 3 weeks' time, you could rock up and there's your home. Absolutely fascinating. And I sort of felt when I was listening to this story, and I think this particular developer and these architects built around about 30,000 of them in Palm Springs over an incredibly short period of time, that if they could achieve that then, why can't we, however many years later, 100, was it 50, 60 years later, 50 years later, 60, 70, 70 years later, why can't we, with all the ingenuity that we have now available, deal with the challenges that we're facing? And just hearing you talk about some of this modular stuff, I think is super interesting. And this idea of pushing back against NIMBYs who don't want development in their areas. They're quite pleased with their, Victorian cottage, single front cottages. But there is also an opportunity for us to start to be a bit smarter about how we build homes that are more affordable and are more targeted towards working class and middle class people to move into the housing market. I think it's really, really interesting.
Yeah, we also want to be able to look at the benefit of infill. When you look to European cities, and they've got a head start on us by a few hundred years as far as what medium density looks like. You look at the way in which neighbourhoods have evolved, and things are within walking distance of where and how people like to live. And rail networks and public transport and active transport are a big feature of the way that many of the geographically confined large cities have evolved. I think we also need to look to technology. I think that's absolutely right around those new and emerging industries that can make homes that are incredibly energy efficient. They are incredibly comfortable to live in. They are comparatively much cheaper to build than they ever have been. They are fire resistant, which again, for some of the harshest conditions that we have around risk and exposure to natural disaster, is super important. But we also need to make sure that we are living in a way that is enabling growth for a city where our population is going to continue to expand. And this is back to the point I was making earlier. We can't keep growing out. We have to grow in and grow up at the same time. And that's a big part of the work that we're doing across the housing statement. And it's also about making sure that we continue to deliver on housing at an ever greater pace. And as I said, what we're doing is working, but it's not happening by accident. It's a whole lot of work across many parts of government. And it's also work that we need the community to be part of too. And change is really hard. It's really hard to see a neighbourhood changing. But, ever since the Melbourne to Lilydale line was built as a rail line out in the 1880s, that cut through farmland. And there was a whole outcry then. And then the orchards that grew up around that farmland then got carved up into large housing blocks. And that was met with a whole lot of dissent, essentially. And then they were subdivided. And at that chapter, there was a lot of community resistance. And now we see precincts being developed for medium and high-rise development, and that is being met with resistance. The level crossing removal program, again, was a really hard thing because it involved a lot of change. It involved disruption. So I think any responsible government that is leaning into addressing problems by acting needs to accommodate resistance to change and to understand the impact that change has on people as the landscape changes, as communities change. And so the Palm Springs of the 50s and the 70s and everywhere in between is not dissimilar to what we saw with a lot of the temporary towns in Victoria. Yallourn, for example, was a temporary town, and that was built. That was built for the purpose of housing people who were building the power stations, and that no longer exists. But it had a similar sort of feel to it as a series of streets with homes that were all but identical. That now, looking back at photographs and at footage, had a beautiful quaintness to them. It was the essence of community frozen in time. And that's an important part of recognising history, but it's also about understanding that what we may have done is not necessarily something that will serve us well into the future.
Last fun fact about Palm Springs, and the reason why it became the playground for Hollywood types was because into their contracts, they couldn't go any more than 100 kilometres from the Warner Brothers studio whilst they were filming. And Palm Springs falls within that distance. The second reason why they went there was also written into their contracts. There was an agreement between the studios and the paparazzi that the paparazzi couldn't take photos of the actors and actresses outside of a certain zone, and Palm Springs fell outside of that zone. So therefore they could go and, do their whatever, basically let their hair down in Palm
Well, that
Springs.
sounds like Parliament. So in Parliament, no, it doesn't. But I'm going to make a point here. Not to say that we could ever be compared with Hollywood stars, unless Gerard Depardieu is part of the lineup. But it's a case that when the bells ring in Parliament, we've got 4 minutes to hot-foot it into the chamber. So everywhere within 4 minutes walk of the chamber, or sprint or trot, however you might want to move, is fair game. But you run the risk. It's like Squid Game, right? You run the risk of being caught out if you're not able to get back for a vote. So there are a whole lot of businesses within that tiny little circle around Parliament that I think do very well, simply because we don't like to be trapped if we can possibly avoid it in the building any longer than we have to be. That's the one story of the symmetry I can find between maybe Grace Kelly and the Legislative Assembly.
You've done well. You've
Thanks.
done very well. I want to shift the conversation to cost of living and broadly the economy, but also jobs. I felt like this year there was a bit of pressure on the Victorian State government, not just from the media, but I think also within the broader Labor movement about, how are we going? The polls aren't going well. And then the government made the announcement around the work from home issue or topic or whatever. And things really changed. And I kind of felt like Stella got her groove back in that moment. Like it was like, this is Labor doing what Labor does, and that is coming up with ideas that are targeted towards our core group of voters that we've had the support of for a number of years, and particularly women in the workforce, but not just them. And it went down really well, and you started to see Labor both climbing the polls, but also I felt like they were had a bit more surer footing. Just give us a sense of if that was the mood, certainly within the caucus as well, but also what else needs to be done in this space, do you think, heading into the election next year as well?
Yeah, I think working from home has really tapped into a desire for families to reduce the amount of time that they're spending travelling to work. And this gets back to the point I was making earlier. If we are in a position to design better communities, we're also in a position to design better workplaces. And the way that people work has become much more flexible than it ever has been. And I think in some part, the innovation, the forced innovation that happened during the pandemic invited a whole lot of progress around how people connect. And that might have been telehealth, it might have been working from home, it might have been home-based education with online delivery of classes, it might have been accessing a degree or vocational education and training. This has led, I think, to a pretty significant conversation that has also been backed up as showing more productivity and better rates of worker retention. But it's also been really important, for example, for women and for households where there are kids involved or caring responsibilities involved. It means that if you have someone who, again, is a primary carer of little kids or of parents, and they can combine those responsibilities, whether that's dropping off or picking up kids from childcare or from school, and then going back to work, or being able to be at home 2 or 3 days a week in order to be managing childcare responsibilities or managing that balance that's so important for being able to retain somebody, particularly if they live hours away from a place where they might commute to. That's actually something that makes a lot of sense, particularly in areas where we've got shortages in the job market in some pretty key industries. And it was interesting to hear, I think it was Tim Wilson, talk about this as professional apartheid, which was not only really vulgar as a description of a workplace innovation primarily to help women to be in the paid workforce, but it also ignored the fact that for generations, women have been excluded from the paid workforce because there has been an insistence that people present every single day, 5 or 6 days a week, to a specific office environment, and that hasn't been compatible with childcare or family responsibilities. So there's a lot in that. It also saves people a lot of money. If you're working from home 1 or 2 days a week, and that means you're not sitting in traffic, particularly from the western suburbs, as we were talking about earlier, where there's a large proportion of people, at least on census data, who are within the professional category. If there is an opportunity for them to work from home 1 or 2 days a week, that saves people money. It means they're not having to fill up, with petrol as often. It means they're not sitting in traffic as often. And it then means that they're able to spend more time doing other things. And so it's about work-life balance. It stacks up as much as anything because the partners of people who are working flexibly are also able to get the benefit of that too. And 2 incomes in a household makes a lot of difference when it comes to managing the cost of living. And that's, again, similarly why we've got initiatives like free TAFE. If that means that free TAFE combined with universal access to 3 and 4-year-old kinder creates an opportunity for somebody to get a qualification in an area where there is a real need and a shortage in a workforce. Because of that course, they can get that qualification and their children can be in free 3 and 4-year-old kinder. That means you're moving away from perhaps one income to two, and that you're saving between $2,000 and $2,500 a year per child. Like, all of these things add up to assist with the cost of living, and it's a very real challenge for people. Where again, we still need to see wages keep pace with inflation. We still need to put downward pressure on house prices to make them more affordable. But these initiatives, when combined, really do make a difference. And working from home is as much about equity as anything else.
The other big thing that happened this year was quite a historic thing, actually. Something that I think that if you spoke to people from our First Nations communities maybe 10 years ago, they would think that's never going to happen. But, of course, I'm talking about the treaty that was signed between the Victorian First Nations Assembly and the Victorian State government. I was away for all of the festivities and the celebration of the signing of the treaty, which is annoying because I'd spent a lot of time working on this campaign with the Assembly. But one, just gives a sense of the mood in the government when it was signed, first of all, and I'll come to you with a question about what it actually will mean for First Nations peoples going forward.
So treaty is enormously significant. The first treaty in Australia has really paved the way for recognition within the system that was effectively set up to exclude First Peoples. You couldn't design a more perfect system, in fact, to exclude the oldest continuous culture on earth from decision-making and from rights, whether it was to land or to jobs or to education, the opportunity to generate intergenerational wealth. All of that was effectively designed out. And the Yurruk Justice Commission was a process of truth-telling that laid bare a lot of this trauma, a lot of the loss, a lot of the economic disadvantage, and a lot of the fundamental injustice at the heart of the last 200 plus years. We've got a lot of work to do in that space, and that's where treaty is a really important mechanism for that to happen. Now, a couple of things that are really important to note, though. Treaty doesn't override the will of the Parliament. It doesn't displace the work of the Parliament. It doesn't remove the systems that exist to make law in Victoria. Despite what anyone says, that's not what it does. It's also about making sure that in the process of making law, there is consideration of the impact of law on First Peoples, and it's about creating a pathway for the First Peoples Assembly to provide advice to government. So it's a conversation and it's a partnership. It's not a veto. And there's a lot of mis and disinformation that has been weaponised against the course of treaty. The opposition, the Liberals and the Nationals, had previously supported treaty. They had previously held a position of support for treaty, and they all stood up and spoke at various points about how they supported it. Well, not all of them, a significant majority of them. And yet when it came to treaty being put to the Parliament, it was opposed by the coalition. It was opposed for a number of reasons that again repeat the same tired old tropes about saying we need to be bridging the gap first, or we commit to closing the gap. And that's up there with lines like the Liberal Party doesn't need quotas. We just need to make sure that we encourage more women to be part of the political process. Well, that doesn't work. So it's about saying, how do we change the system so that we are recognising that there is a very uneasy lack of alignment in the way that existing systems have operated, and where we need to get to correct that course. So the coalition voted against it. They oppose it. And when it came to the historic apology that the Premier made in Parliament in the last sitting day, that apology was a recognition of historic injustices. It was as much as anything about the theft of language and opportunity and culture and connection, but it was also about saying that treaty is a big part of how we step forward into a chapter in Victorian history that is more squarely based in dignity and partnership and fairness. And the coalition voted against the apology. And they made accusations about the politicisation of the apology. And that to me was such a shame. It was such a shame because we have an opportunity as a parliament to show very clearly a sense of unity around what we all, at least say, we acknowledge as systemic injustices. And that's where I think the parliament could and should have done better. But we have treaty. We had an extraordinary celebration of treaty. It has had a process of careful consideration and passage into law. And we will continue the work now to try to recover for First Peoples some of the ground that was taken.
And I thought that, according to The Age and The Guardian, the new leader of the Liberal Party is a moderate. So why did she vote against it? Who knows? But I guess we'll find out.
Well, she had initially said that she supported the voice to Parliament, and that's then been an interesting turn as far as her position on treaty and on the apology. And this is, again, I think that speaks to internal battlegrounds in the Liberal Party. They're at a real crossroads. They are having an existential tussle, the likes of which I haven't seen before. And the opprobrium, the venom that gets hurled around is something that if I'm hearing about it, must be a really big deal because I'm certainly not in that party room.
Do you think she'll still be leader when it comes to the election in November next year?
Well, I mean, you might beg the question whether she's actually the leader or leading on behalf of people who got her the numbers to get her into the position in the first place. There is a great challenge that Jess has around delivering a set of policies and ideas whilst at the same time being backed by and dependent upon the most conservative parts of the Liberal Party. And I think the Liberals don't have a clear idea of what they stand for at the moment because they're so riven by the idea on the one hand of personal freedom and the opportunity to succeed on one's own terms, and the idea of an interventionist government that has very clear rules and regulations about who can and can't do what. So we're stuck, I think, between the 1850s and the 1950s, and that's something they're going to have to nut out for themselves.
When the clock strikes 12 on the 1st of January 2026, will have now entered into officially an election year in Victoria. How are you and the government feeling about heading into next year in terms of the campaign, and where do you think Labor needs to focus its energies on in communicating to the electorate why it should get another 4 years?
Feeling determined to make sure that we are consolidating the work that we've done, whether that's on cost of living or on housing or on access to services, including infrastructure, whether that's in making sure that we have good, inclusive programs and services. We've got a whole lot of work that is coming to fruition around large-scale builds. The Footscray Hospital, the work in Melton, the work in our community health network, the spaces and places that we've created throughout our education program, the TAFE campuses that we've opened, the level crossings that we've removed. All of these things continue to be part of what we've delivered, but it's then also about saying how are we creating jobs, how are we creating business opportunities, how are we ensuring good productivity and a good fiscal strategy, and all of those things. No matter how much people want to talk the state down, all of those things are succeeding. And then again, that's not happening by accident. It's happening because there is a huge degree of unity and of determination and of focus within government to make sure that we continue to deliver on that opportunity, whether you live in the middle of Melbourne or right out at the border or anywhere in between, that you are able to access the sorts of programs and services and infrastructure that we have placed right around the state. And there's always more work to do, always. And if anyone ever thinks that the job is ever done in government, then they shouldn't try to be in it, because that's not what it's about. It's also about making sure that we don't jeopardise the things that we've done because a coalition, if successful in November, will come along with at least $11 billion worth of cuts that they won't provide, no matter how much they protest to the contrary. They won't provide any framework for delivering more housing. They won't provide cost of living relief. They won't deliver infrastructure. They won't deliver on the sort of investments in education or in healthcare. This is the sort of thing that is at risk, but it's also the sort of work that prompts us to keep going with that sense of purpose and, as I said, determination. And I think the Premier's done an extraordinary job. She has not only defined herself on her own terms, but she's paved the way for so much investment and prosperity in the state, for business and investment and industry conditions to thrive. And we're seeing the results of that hard work through everything from the Metro Tunnel right through to the way that we're seeing, more than 130,000 businesses created. This is work that, again, has to happen simultaneously. Again, governments don't just do one thing at once. And this is work that has been tireless, and there's a lot of work to go yet.
And it's an important point you make. You're right. This work is tireless. Like, coming up with ideas that address the challenges in a fast-growing state like Victoria is tough. And you've been in this government now for a number of years, so you've seen the work that goes into doing that, like getting rid of level crossings or free tape just don't appear. It's sort of, it takes a lot of creativity and intelligence to design that kind of stuff. And I look at the other side, and when they have their ideas meetings and looking at each other going, well, have you got anything? Like, no.
Well, do you know they're up to about 23 positions on the suburban rail loop now. So if they could come up with ideas in the same way that they come up with positions that change regularly, then perhaps they might have a bit of a canon of an offering for Victoria. But as it stands, opposition is about opposing. It's not actually about creating the conditions for a viable government. And time after time, leader after leader, caucus after caucus, eviction after eviction, they've proven that they're happy to chuck rocks from sidelines, but they're inward facing to the exclusion of looking out for ideas that would service Victoria were they to be in government.
They have no purpose. Before we wrap up, it would be remiss of me to not ask you about how the donkeys are going.
Okay, I know you've got a listener who tunes out every time I talk to this particular point. I just want to say to that listener that the donkeys and I send our love and regards and wishes for the season to you and to your family, and we will continue to love you no matter what. They're really well. They're super fluffy at the moment. I've been waging a battle against capeweed all over the block, and so that's seen me out at every opportunity with the spray backpack or otherwise pulling weeds out. I know it's become they are my bête noire, so it's become my challenge, and so they just follow me around thinking that I'm absolutely bonkers. But it does give me a good opportunity to listen to the old podcast. I was going to give you a plug, but I'm not going to, because I'm quite literally in the middle of possibly being my own audience while I'm next out weeding. But it's so meta. But they're a delight. We lost one of our dogs earlier this year, so at some point we will be on the hunt for another one. And that's going to be an interesting exercise, given that it has often required some pretty intensive advocacy for me to overcome some internal objections to more animals. But I'll get there. That's how community campaigns are won, with persistence and charm.
That's it. Persistence beat resistance, is what we always said in student politics.
Exactly.
Harriet Shing, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. I don't know how long this episode is going to be now because we had to record it in like 5 different parts. The gods were not wanting us to do this, but we got there in the end. Before we close up, this is our last episode before the Christmas break. Well, in fact, maybe this is going up on Friday, which is now Boxing Day, and you're probably either watching the cricket or at the beach. Either way, this is sort of the last episode for the year. Can I say to all of our listeners, thank you very much for supporting the show. We're in our 6th year, I think. Maybe this is it must be our 2019. Yeah, it's our 6th year. So we enter our 7th year next year. And, you know, we enjoy doing the podcast, but this year we started with the Patreon community, and it's been great to sort of actually get feedback as opposed to us just talking into the void. We're now hearing back from our listeners about what they want us to talk about and what their thoughts and reflections are and stuff. So we also want to take the opportunity to thank our Patreon subscribers. Plus also when you're on Patreon, you're giving us your hard-earned money, and we are eternally grateful for that. Because that's a very, very generous thing for you to do. So we thank you. We wish everyone out there that you have a great Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever you celebrate, Festivus for the rest of us, that you have a safe and prosperous break and a great new year. We'll see you in the new year. And to you, Harriet Shing, keep on doing the good work that you do.
Thank you so much. Have a beautiful, safe and happy festive period, everyone. And I know that this year's been really tough for so many people, and so to anyone who has found 2025 particularly difficult, I wish nothing but happier and healthier times ahead.
Hear, hear. Hey, Social Democrats, thanks for listening. Today's episode was hosted by myself, Stephen Donnelly, and produced by Grace Eyre. If you like the show, please rate us and review us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really like the show, then join our Patreon community for early and ad-free access to each episode. We regularly take questions and comments from our Patreon members, so get in there if you want to have your say. And finally, get all the latest updates and bonus content by following Socially Democratic on our social media channels. The links are in our show notes. See you next Friday.